Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're all about taking a deep dive into fascinating topics, and today it's something I think we all wonder about. What really makes people successful? We're diving into the power of passion and perseverance to give you, the learner, all the key insights, but in a way you can actually use. No jargon overload here.
That's right. We've all seen those headlines. Someone achieved something incredible, and the first thing we hear is, oh, they're so talented. It's like talent explains everything, whether it's sports, business, art, whatever. But is it really that simple?
Well, that's what we're exploring today, because what we found in this book suggests it's not just about raw talent. There's something else going on, something maybe even more important, and that's what we're going to uncover together.
I think it's interesting to consider why this whole focus on talent can actually be a little bit misleading. The author of Grit has this story about her dad, who was a smart guy, but he was worried that his kids weren't, geniuses. He even compared them to Einstein.
Oh, I totally get that. It's like this classic parental anxiety, right? You want your kids to be brilliant, to stand out.
Yeah, exactly. But then contrast that with the author later winning a MacArthur Fellowship.
The Genius Grant.
Exactly. And you don't apply for it, right? It's this secret committee of top experts in your field who decide you're doing amazing work. So it's not about potential anymore. It's about what you actually achieve.
It really flips the script, doesn't it?
It does. And this kind of personal experience led the author to become a teacher. It's like she went from this world of high achievement to wanting to understand how it actually happens with real students in a real classroom, especially coming from McKinsey, that prestigious consulting firm. I bet her colleagues were surprised when she left to teach.
That's pretty big change.
Yeah. A real-world example of following a different path. And in that classroom, she met students like David Loon. He was a bit behind in math at first.
Struggling to keep up.
Yeah, but instead of just accepting it, he put in the effort, asked for help, and guess what? By senior year, he was acing AP Calculus.
Wow, from behind to top of the class.
He even got a perfect score on the AP exam and ended up with dual degrees from Swarthmore. It makes you question whether those aptitude tests really tell the whole story, right?
Absolutely. David's story is like a perfect example of how focusing only on talent misses the point.
It really does. It's like we limit ourselves when we only focus on talent and forget about effort, perseverance, and even seeking support.
Speaking of limitations, let's talk about Scott Barry Kaufman. He's super successful now with degrees from Carnegie Mellon, Cambridge, Yale, and he plays the cello. But get this. He was labeled as having a learning disability early on and put in special education.
It's amazing how those early labels can be so misleading.
Right. It's like they put you in a box and it's hard to break out.
But Scott didn't just accept it. He intentionally took on challenges, Latin, musical theater, choir, things that were hard for him. And when he found something he loved, the cello, he practiced like crazy 8-9 hours a day.
So he was driven to prove something.
Yeah, to prove that he was capable, that he was smart. It wasn't just about enjoying the music. And this really gets to the heart of what this book is all about.
That effort matters, maybe even more than talent.
Absolutely. And that brings us to this idea of grit. The book defines it as passion and perseverance for long-term goals. It's not just about being excited about something for a little while. It's about sticking with it, even when it gets hard.
And this whole concept of grit really came to life in the studies they did at West Point. They were trying to predict which cadets would drop out of Beast Barracks, that super intense training. They had this whole candidate score looking at SATs, high school rank, leadership stuff, physical fitness.
That sounds pretty thorough, right? Like they were really trying to figure out who had the potential to succeed.
Yeah, but here's the thing. That score, which was supposed to predict success, couldn't tell them who would actually stick it out and who would quit.
So all those traditional measures of potential were basically useless in this situation.
Pretty much. And military psychologist Mike Matthews, he noticed something really important. He said that cadets rarely dropped out because they weren't smart enough or strong enough. The key difference was their attitude.
So it was about mental toughness, not necessarily physical or intellectual ability.
Exactly. It was about that never give up attitude, that determination to keep going when things got really, really tough. And when the author did her research at West Point, grit turned out to be incredibly accurate at predicting who would make it through Beast Barracks, not just 1 year, but 2 years in a row.
That's pretty amazing. So it wasn't just a fluke. Grit was consistently a better predictor than all those other fancy measures.
Right. And it wasn't just a military thing either. They did a study in the Chicago public schools where they were trying to figure out who would graduate high school. And again, grit was a better predictor than things like how much kids cared about school or how conscientious they were, even how safe they felt at school.
So grit was more important than those other factors, even in a school system where a lot of students were dropping out.
Exactly. And they used a shorter version of the grit scale in that study, showing that even a quick self-assessment could be helpful. And then they took this research even further, working with the Army Special Operations Forces, the Green Berets.
Oh, wow, that's serious stuff.
Yeah, their training is legendary, and they wanted to see if grit played a role in who made it through. They focused on the Special Forces Selection Course, which is where they decide who gets to continue training. As the commanding general put it, it's where they decide who will and who will not. It's all about finding those individuals with that deep down perseverance.
So we see grit is important in all these really challenging situations. But how does it actually work? The book introduces this idea that effort counts twice, and it's represented by a simple but powerful equation.
Oh yeah, the talent times effort equals skill, and then skill times effort equals achievement.
Right. It means talent gives you a starting point, your potential. But it's effort that turns that potential into actual skills. You can be naturally gifted at something, but if you don't put in the work, it doesn't really matter.
So you could be a natural athlete, but if you never practice, you won't actually become a good athlete.
Exactly. And then, once you've developed your skills through effort, it's effort again that determines what you achieve with those skills. So if two people have the same amount of talent, the one who works harder will end up with greater skills and achieve more.
It's like compound interest, but with effort. The more you put in, the more you get out over time.
Precisely. And a lot of really successful people talk about this, like Will Smith. Remember when he said, "I'm not talented, I'm obsessed"?
Oh yeah, I love that quote.
It's like he's acknowledging that it's his relentless dedication, not just some innate gift, that's gotten him where he is. And this idea of pushing yourself isn't new. Back in the 1940s, Harvard did this treadmill test with young men, and it wasn't just about physical ability.
They wanted to see how much they could push themselves.
Yeah, how long they were willing to keep running even when it got uncomfortable. And then a psychiatrist named George Vallon followed those men for decades, collecting all this data about their lives, careers, health, relationships, everything.
So what did they learn after all those years?
That willingness to push oneself on the treadmill way back then actually predicted how well they adjusted psychologically in adulthood decades later.
Wow, so that early sign of perseverance actually said something about their overall well-being much later in life.
Exactly. It suggests that this inner drive, this ability to not give up easily, has a really big impact on our lives in many different areas.
Yeah.
And the author even proposes this cool hypothetical. What if they let those guys come back and do the treadmill test again, maybe multiple times? It's like creating a grit score based on how much they improve, how willing they are to keep trying.
That would be fascinating. So it's not just about mindless grinding, there's a strategy to it.
Right. And that's what grit really is. It's about working on something you deeply care about, the passion part, and then sticking with it, even when it's hard, the perseverance part. Finding something you love and then loving it enough to stick with it, even when it's not easy.
Okay, so how do we actually measure this thing called grit? The book introduces the grit scale, which the author developed and used in her research.
And remember, this scale is just a snapshot of where you are right now. It's not like your IQ, which is supposed to be stable. Your grit can change over time, depending on your experiences.
So you might score differently if you take the test again later.
Exactly. The grit scale looks at both passion and perseverance. The odd-numbered questions are more about how consistently you're interested in something, and the even-numbered questions are about your ability to overcome setbacks and stay committed. You can even calculate separate scores for each of those aspects.
So it gives you a more detailed picture of your grit.
Right. And the book has a table that shows you where your score falls compared to other people, so you can get a sense of how gritty you are relative to the average.
That's helpful for understanding yourself better. So we know what grit is. We know how to measure it, but how do we actually develop it? The book explores 4 key areas that can help us become grittier, and the first one is interest.
And this is where that classic advice, follow your passion, comes in. But the author has a slightly different take on it. She looks at her father's life, and he didn't start out with a burning passion for his work at DuPont. It was a practical choice that, over time, he came to love.
So passion can develop over time, even if you don't start out feeling super passionate.
Right. It makes you think about whether we should always prioritize passion from the get-go, or if sometimes a more practical approach can lead to passion later on. It's not always as simple as follow your bliss.
That's interesting, but she's not saying we should ignore our interests completely, right?
No, not at all. She points to people like Will Shortz, the New York Times puzzle editor, and Jeff Bezos, who clearly built their careers around their passions. And there's research showing that being interested in your work makes you happier and more successful.
But the point is that those passions usually don't just appear fully formed.
Exactly. They need to be cultivated and refined over time.
And you have to put in the effort to develop them. It's like anything else, right? If you want to get good at something, you have to practice.
Absolutely. And it's important to have realistic expectations, especially for young people. Psychologist Benjamin Bloom studied world-class experts and found that even they start as unserious beginners. Those early stages are all about exploring, having fun, getting encouragement, and celebrating small wins. The criticism and intense practice come later. If you push too hard too soon, you can actually stifle that initial spark of interest.
It's like learning to ride a bike. You wouldn't expect a kid to start doing jumps and tricks on their first day.
Right. Think about Will Shortz's mom. She encouraged his interest in puzzles, but she also got him a guitar just because he was curious about music. It was about providing opportunities for exploration, not pushing him to become a master right away.
So it's about creating a supportive environment where kids can explore their interests without pressure.
Exactly. And as people become experts, their interest changes. Beginners get excited about anything new, but experts are drawn to the nuances, the deeper understanding of their field. The book compares it to running. You have to track your progress and add variety to your workouts, otherwise you'll hit a plateau, even if you love running.
So interest is the starting point, but it needs the right kind of attention and engagement to become a real passion. And that brings us to the second key area for developing grit: practice.
And not just any kind of practice, but deliberate practice. It's about setting goals that push you beyond your comfort zone, focusing completely on what you're doing, getting feedback, and then repeating the process. It's not just about putting in the hours, it's about how you use those hours.
The book gives the example of spelling bee champions. Their practice isn't just reading the dictionary. They memorize words, they study word origins and patterns, they constantly test themselves.
It's very focused and intentional. And it's different from flow, that feeling of being totally absorbed in an activity that Csikszentmihalyi described. Flow feels effortless when you're performing at your peak.
So there's this debate about whether deliberate practice or flow is more important. But the author actually saw Anders Ericsson, who's big on deliberate practice, and Csikszentmihalyi talking about this, and they were very respectful of each other's views.
Yeah, it's not like you have to choose one or the other. Spelling bee champ Carrie Close talked about how flow happens when you're not being challenged, while deliberate practice is a different kind of rewarding experience. It's about breaking down a difficult problem and mastering it.
So deliberate practice might not always be fun and easy, but it's crucial for getting better at something, and it can be very satisfying in its own way. And the third key area for building grit is purpose.
And purpose, in this context, is about wanting to contribute to something bigger than yourself. It's about finding meaning in your work that goes beyond just personal gain or pleasure. It's more about eudaimonic happiness, that deep fulfillment you get from doing something meaningful than just hedonic pleasure, which is more about immediate gratification.
And the research is pretty clear on this. They studied over 16,000 American adults and found that grittier people are much more motivated by wanting to live a meaningful life that makes a difference to others.
It's not that they don't enjoy pleasure, it's just that their primary drive is something bigger than that.
Exactly. And Amy Rosanowski, a professor at Yale, did this research on how people view their work. She found that people who see their work as a calling, as something deeply important to them, are way grittier than those who just see it as a job or a career.
It's like that story of the bricklayers. One sees himself as just laying bricks, while the other sees himself as building a cathedral.
It's the same work, but the meaning is totally different.
And that difference in meaning makes all the difference in terms of how much effort and passion you put into it.
And the book argues that a calling isn't something you just find. It's something you create by connecting your work to something larger than yourself, to other people, to a bigger purpose.
Like Dr. Michael Krasner, who started a meditation class for his patients. He found so much meaning in helping them that it eventually became his main focus.
So he didn't set out to be a meditation teacher, but his sense of purpose led him there.
Exactly. And Bill Damon, who studies purpose in young people, says we should be intentionally helping them develop their sense of purpose. He says everyone has some initial spark of purpose that can be nurtured.
It's like that story of Kat, who grew up poor but ended up owning a chain of bakeries. She was always driven by this desire to help others, even in small ways, like offering food to people waiting outside her shop.
And that's what fueled her success. It wasn't just about making money or being a businesswoman. It was about making a difference.
And the research on pro-social motivation shows that wanting to benefit others can be incredibly motivating. So finding that connection to something bigger than yourself is crucial for building grit. And the fourth and final key area is hope.
And hope, in this context, is really about learned optimism. It comes from Martin Seligman's work on learned helplessness, which is basically about giving up when you feel like you have no control over bad things happening to you.
So learned optimism is the opposite of that.
Exactly. It's about how you explain setbacks to yourself. Optimists see bad events as temporary and specific, while pessimists see them as permanent and pervasive.
Like if you fail a test, an optimist might say, well, I didn't study enough for this particular test, while a pessimist might say, I'm just bad at this subject.
Exactly. And that difference in explanation has a huge impact on your behavior. There was this study with elite swimmers where they tricked some of them into thinking they swam slower than they actually did. The optimists didn't let it get to them and continued performing well, but the pessimists actually performed worse after that.
So your mindset really matters.
It does. And the book points out that people with a lot of grit tend to explain things in an optimistic way. They see failures as opportunities to learn and grow, not as evidence that they're not good enough.
And this ties into Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset.
Right. Growth mindset is the belief that you can improve your abilities and intelligence through effort, while the fixed mindset is the belief that talent is something you're born with and can't really change.
And a fixed mindset can be a real killer for grit because it makes you see setbacks as proof that you're just not cut out for something.
Exactly. And the way parents react to their kids' mistakes can actually influence their mindset. If parents treat mistakes as something bad, even if they consciously believe in growth, kids are more likely to develop a fixed mindset.
So it's not just about what you say, it's about how you act.
Right. And this applies to workplaces too. Companies with a fixed mindset can stifle creativity and trust, while companies with a growth mindset encourage people to learn and take risks.
It's about creating an environment where people feel safe to make mistakes and learn from them.
And as Bill McNabb, a former CEO of Vanguard, said, it's about learning from mistakes, not being defined by them.
So building hope is about recognizing that people can change and improve. It's about giving yourself and others the benefit of the doubt and seeing setbacks as temporary.
There's even this fascinating research with rats, where they found that rats who experienced controllable stress when they were young were more resilient to learned helplessness as adults. It suggests that having some agency and overcoming challenges early on can actually make you more hopeful and resilient later in life.
So maybe letting kids struggle a little bit is actually good for them in the long run.
It might be, but it's also important to provide support and guidance to help them learn from those struggles.
It's about finding that balance between challenge and support.
Right. And practicing optimistic self-talk can also be helpful. It's about consciously reframing negative thoughts into something more positive and constructive. There's even this therapy called resilience training that's been shown to reduce pessimism and depression.
So there are actual techniques you can learn to become more optimistic.
There are. And the story of Grit Young, who did this crazy sit-up competition for decades, is a perfect example of what unwavering perseverance fueled by hope looks like.
It's amazing what people can achieve when they set their minds to it.
It really is. And the book also talks about the importance of what they call wise parenting or authoritative parenting. It's a style that combines high expectations with a lot of love and support.
So it's not about being a drill sergeant or being overly permissive. It's about finding that sweet spot in the middle.
Right. And this kind of parenting encourages kids to not just imitate their parents, but to really emulate them. They admire and understand the reasons behind their parents' values and behaviors, and they're more likely to develop similar interests and levels of grit.
It's like showing them, not just telling them.
Exactly. And Cody Coleman's story is a great example of the impact a supportive environment can have. He was pretty unmotivated at first, but a conversation with his brother and a supportive teacher helped him adopt this why not attitude, and he ended up excelling academically.
So grit isn't just an individual trait. It's also shaped by the people and environments around us.
Absolutely. And Warren Willingham's research on the grit grid really highlights this. He looked at kids who participated in extracurricular activities over multiple years and found that sticking with those commitments was a better predictor of success in college than grades alone.
So it's not just about being smart, it's about being dedicated.
Exactly. And studies have shown that kids with higher grid scores are more likely to stay in college.
It makes sense. If you're used to sticking with things, you're more likely to persevere when things get tough in college.
Right. And while personality does change over time, there's this idea called the corresponsive principle that suggests our traits can lead us to situations that reinforce those traits, creating either virtuous or vicious cycles.
So being gritty can lead you to situations that make you even grittier.
It can. And even college admissions officers recognize this. Bill Fitzsimmons, the dean of admissions at Harvard, has said that they look for genuine interest and passion in applicants, even if it's not directly related to academics.
They're looking for that spark, that drive that suggests someone will stick with something and make a real contribution.
Exactly. And Jeffrey Canada, who's done a lot of work on education reform, points out that while a lot of the research on grit isn't based on controlled experiments, the patterns we see across different studies are still really valuable.
It's about looking at the big picture and seeing what the evidence tells us, even if it's not perfect.
Right. And the author even shares this hard thing rule that her family has. Everyone has to do something challenging that requires daily, deliberate practice.
So they're intentionally building a culture of grit in their home.
They are. And swimming coach Dan Chambliss has this great quote, "To become a great swimmer, join a great team." It's about the power of culture, how the values and behaviors of a group can shape individuals.
It makes you think about whether we can intentionally create cultures that support grit, like those Finnish people with their sisu.
Sisu is like this extraordinary perseverance, this ability to push through incredible hardship. It's pretty amazing.
It makes you wonder what we could achieve if we all had a little bit more sisu.
It does. But it's also important to remember that extreme grit can have downsides, and there's a need for balance. Sometimes you need to know when to quit or change course.
It's about being smart about your grit.
Exactly. And realistically, given the way things are now, a widespread epidemic of grit seems pretty unlikely.
Maybe, but maybe we can at least create pockets of grit, communities and organizations where these values are celebrated and nurtured.
I hope so.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into grit, the takeaway for you, the learner, is this. While talent is often what gets noticed, it's grit, that combination of passion and perseverance, that really drives long-term success.
And remember, grit isn't something you're born with or without. It's something you can develop by nurturing your interests, embracing deliberate practice, finding your purpose, and cultivating hope.
We encourage you to think about what we've talked about today and see how you can apply these principles to your own life, to your own goals, and to the challenges you're facing.
And ask yourself this, what's one area where you could shift your focus from relying solely on talent to really putting in the effort and sticking with it? What hard thing could you choose to embrace?
That's a great question to ponder. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
It's been a pleasure.